Denied at the door, Karoline Leavitt adjusted her coat as the Cadillac Escalade eased to a stop outside Liberty Bistro, her and her husband's favorite Manhattan restaurant. Inside the SUV, the engine hummed softly. Karoline, White House Press. Secretary scrolled through emails on her phone, eyes sharp, fingers quick. Her husband, Nicholas Riccio, a seasoned real estate developer, stole a glance at her. His voice, deep and warm, cut through the quiet. "Put the phone down. Tonight's ours." She hesitated, then exhaled, offering a faint smile. Nicholas knew that look. Her mind was still in battle mode. Steering the Trump administration's media machine didn't leave much room for unwinding. He reached for her hand. "I just want a quiet dinner," she murmured. Outside, the neon sign of Liberty Bistro flickered in the cool Manhattan night. A place they'd come to escape the noise, if only for a moment. Nicholas smirked, rolling up his sleeves. "I just missed the steak." She let out a soft laugh, but as they stepped onto the sidewalk, her grip on his hand tightened. "I hope no one recognizes me tonight." A doorway to disdain, the scent of seared meat and herbs welcomed them as they entered. Soft golden light glowed. Against polished mahogany tables, the hum of conversation filling the air. For a second, it felt normal. Then, a shadow emerged from behind the hostess stand. Ethan Caldwell, manager, late 40s. Crisp gray suit, a polite but strained smile. "Mrs. Leavitt." "Mr. Riccio." His voice was measured, almost rehearsed. "I'm very sorry, but we can't serve you tonight." Silence. Karoline halted mid-step, brows arching. "What did you just say?" Her voice was razor-sharp. Nicholas squared his shoulders. "Excuse me?" Ethan swallowed but stood firm. "We have to ask you to leave." For a moment, neither Karoline nor Nicholas spoke. Then Karoline let out a cold, sharp laugh. "Inclusion," she repeated mockingly. "You call this inclusion?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "It's not personal." Nicholas's jaw clenched. "Ethan, we've been coming here for years." His voice was calm but edged with something steely. "What's the problem?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. Mrs. Leavitt's recent social media posts on immigration, DEI, have sparked backlash. Some patrons threatened to boycott if we continued serving you. Karoline's expression darkened. "You mean a mob threatened you?" Ethan cleared his throat. "We're just trying to avoid trouble." "So instead, you created it." Karoline pulled her phone from her purse, thumb flicking fast over the screen. "You want to talk about social media? Fine. Let's show the world what your inclusion really looks like." Nicholas raised a hand. "Karoline, don't." His eyes stayed locked on Ethan. His tone was low, deadly calm. "You know, I almost invested in this place a few years back. Prime location, great space." He tilted his head. "Now I see I dodged a bullet." Ethan flinched. "Mr. Riccio, please. This isn't personal." Nicholas gave a small, knowing smile. "That's exactly what makes it worse." Ethan exhaled. "Look, we're willing to accommodate. If you'd prefer the private dining room, we can set it up. Discreetly, no fuss." Karoline's expression hardened. "Private dining?" Her voice erupted. "Like criminals in the back? You think I'm going to hide?" By now the other diners had noticed. Heads turned. Some whispered. Others raised their phones. Karoline's eyes burned into Ethan's. "We're paying customers. We have every right to sit at our table just like anyone else." Ethan took a small step back. "Mrs. Leavitt, Then the ground trembled. A low, sickening groan rippled through the restaurant. The collapse, a thunderous crack. Screams erupted. Chandeliers shook violently. Nicholas grabbed Karoline's arm, pulling her back as the ceiling buckled. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. Ethan's eyes widened in sheer horror as the hostess stand toppled. Karoline and Nicholas stumbled backward, sprinting for the doors. Then, the walls gave in, a deafening roar. Liberty Bistro collapsed. Dust and smoke billowed into the street. People screamed, stumbling onto the sidewalk. Karoline coughed, her eyes stinging from the debris. She turned, watching the restaurant crumble into rubble. A shiver ran through her. 10 minutes ago, they had been denied entry. Now, there was no restaurant left to deny them. Nicholas let out a slow, disbelieving breath. Well, Karoline swallowed, still staring at the destruction. Then, she slipped her phone back into her purse. Guess we're eating somewhere else. A line in the sand. Ethan Caldwell shifted uneasily, hands gripping the reservation book like a lifeline. His polite facade was slipping. I get how you feel, he said carefully, voice edged with discomfort. But I can't do otherwise. This is for the restaurant's and our customers' greater good. I hope you'll understand. Nicholas Riccio's expression darkened. Understand? His voice dropped, low and warning. You think we'll just slink off after this insult? You're picking the wrong side, Mr. Caldwell, and I guarantee you'll see the consequences. His grip on Karoline's hand tightened. He turned to her. What do you want to do, Karoline? Stay and fight this guy or leave? Karoline didn't hesitate. She lifted her chin, fire in her gaze. We're not going anywhere, Nick. Not until they realize they can't treat us like this without a cost. Then, without another word, she raised her phone, hitting Liv. Her voice rang out, crisp and unwavering. Hey everyone, I'm Karoline Leavitt. Right now, at Liberty Bistro, my husband and I have just been refused service because of my political views. The restaurant buzzed. A man at a nearby table stood abruptly, clapping. That's right, Karoline, don't let them bully you, others murmured. A woman in an expensive sweater leaned toward her friend, rolling her eyes. I knew she'd make a scene. Ethan's polite mask crumbled. He glanced at Karoline's phone screen, views skyrocketing by the second. The Liberty Bistro's chandelier. Light flickered across the lens as she turned the camera toward the room, voice sharp as a blade. This is the truth about the freedom they preach. Her eyes locked onto Ethan. They're kicking us out of this restaurant because I work for the Trump administration. This isn't inclusion. It's hypocrisy. Nicholas stood beside her, arms crossed. He didn't need to say anything. His stare, cold, calculating, did all the talking. The room fractured. A middle-aged man near the window rose, clapping. Karoline's right. This is America. No one gets to refuse her. His applause rippled outward, drawing nods from some diners. But in the corner, the woman in the cashmere sweater scoffed. She's just fishing for attention. I came for dinner, not political theater. Her friend smirked, phone in hand, recording. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he smoothed the reservation book. Mrs. Leavitt, he said, voice thin. I don't want this to turn into a public fight. We're just trying to keep the peace for all our customers. If you'd lower the phone, we could talk privately. Karoline's laugh was ice. Privately? She didn't lower the phone. So you can pretend this never happened? No way, Mr. Caldwell. The world needs to see this. She swung the camera toward him, the phone's light making him blink rapidly. You just said this is an inclusive space. But you're kicking us out because some customers don't like my views. She stepped forward, gaze unrelenting. Who are you choosing, Mr. Caldwell? Paying customers like us or the mob threatening to boycott you on Twitter? Nicholas let a hand rest lightly on Karoline's shoulder, steadying her, but his eyes never left Ethan. You know, Nicholas mused, voice calm but razor sharp. I almost invested in this place years ago. Great vibe. Killer menu, a Manhattan gem. He tilted his head, but I backed out for another project. And now? Now I see I was right. Ethan's jaw tensed. Nicholas's voice dropped even lower. Not because of business, but because of management, like you. Silence thickened between them. Ethan exhaled, his fingers white-knuckled on the book. Mr. Riccio, I respect you both immensely, but we have to consider all our customers' feelings, not just yours. He shifted, glancing around, hoping for support, but the room was split. An older man near the bar stood, jabbing a finger at Ethan. I've known Karoline since her congressional run. She's a loyal customer. I signed a deal with her at that table. Right, there. He pointed at an empty booth. You have no right to kick them out. That's right, someone else called. A few scattered claps followed, but across the room, a middle-aged woman in a business suit stood sharply. "I support this decision. We don't want people like her here." Her voice cut through the room, firm and certain. "She stands for discrimination. I came to relax, not face politics." Karoline pivoted the phone toward her. "You just said I stand for discrimination?" Her voice tightened. "And yet you're cheering to kick me out for my job. What do you call that if not discrimination against me?" The live chat exploded. "Stand with Karoline. Trump puppet. Liberty Bistro is finished. Thousands were tuning in by the second." The breaking point, Nicholas shook his head, muttering under his breath. "See? They can't win with reason, so they pull this." The divide in the restaurant widened. A young waitress, her high ponytail swaying as she moved, hesitated before stepping closer to Karoline. She spoke in a low whisper. "Mrs. Leavitt, I'm sorry. I don't agree with this, but Mr. Caldwell said we'd lose our jobs if we pushed back." Karoline's gaze softened for a brief moment. "You don't need to apologize," she said gently. "I know who's calling the shots here." Then she turned back to Ethan, her voice sharpening. "Hear that? Even your own staff doesn't back you." Ethan took a step back, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the reservation book. "I don't have a choice, Mrs. Leavitt." His voice wavered. "This is for the restaurant's good. If you'd just leave, we could avoid bigger trouble." A man in a leather jacket stood abruptly from a corner table, his voice booming across the room. "You just made it. I'm never coming back here after this." He yanked his coat from the back of his chair and stormed toward the exit. Others followed, their chairs scraping against the polished floor. At that moment, a notification pinged from someone's phone, then another, and another. Karoline Expelled was already trending. A woman near the bar leaned in to whisper to her friend, but her words carried. "She's turning this into a political campaign." She shook her head. But Caldwell messed up by escalating. It Nicholas overheard and turned to Karoline, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "See? They're digging their own grave, just one more push." Karoline nodded, her eyes blazing as she lifted her phone again. "This isn't just about me and my husband. It's about them thinking they can exclude anyone who doesn't fit their ideology. But I won't let them win." She lowered the phone slightly, staring straight at Ethan. "You've got 1 minute to change your mind, Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was cold, measured. "Or I promise, you'll regret it." Ethan stood frozen, his face pale, his polite mask completely gone. Around them, diners stirred, some standing to back Karoline, some rising in protest, others simply wanting to escape the battleground the Liberty Bistro had become. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a war zone, and Karoline and Nicholas had no intention of backing down. The restaurant's buzz dimmed as Karoline slowly lowered her phone, her gaze sweeping across the space. White linen-draped tables. The soft, golden glow of the chandeliers. The faint scent of rosemary and garlic drifting from the kitchen, a place she once loved. She gripped Nicholas's hand a little tighter, her voice dropping, not for the live stream, but almost to herself. "Nick, I can't believe we're standing here, being treated like this." Nicholas turned to her, his anger momentarily softening. "I know, Karoline." His gaze flickered toward a table near the window, bathed in the glow of Manhattan streetlights. "Table 14, he murmured, nodding toward it. "Remember, our first time here, after your primary win? I told you, this girl's going places." A faint smile tugged at Karoline's lips, nostalgia washing over her like a tide. "Yeah, and we ordered steak." She exhaled. "You called it a reward for your little warrior." Then, just as quickly, the warmth vanished. She turned back to Ethan, her voice hard as stone. "You know, Mr. Caldwell, that night your staff brought us a bottle of wine on the house to celebrate me." She lifted a brow. "They clapped when we raised our glasses. And now?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Now, you're kicking us out like we're enemies." Ethan's grip on the reservation book tightened, his shoulders sagging slightly. He dropped his gaze, searching for words, but when he finally lifted, His eyes dodged Karoline's. She seized the moment. "Your staff, Mr. Caldwell, made this place special." Her voice rang clear through the hushed room. "Now you want to erase that because of some social media threats?" A murmur spread through the crowd. Some diners nodded, others whispered among themselves. "She's right. He's just caving to pressure. This is going too far." Karoline took a slow step closer. "Don't you see, Mr. Caldwell? This isn't just a restaurant to us. It's where we built milestones, wins, love, family." She lifted her phone again, turning back to the live audience. "Everyone watching, this was our home, and now they're saying we're not welcome, just because I work for someone a few people don't like." Ethan cleared his throat, trying to maintain control. "Mrs. Leavitt, I'm sorry if this hurts you, but we have to think of the greater good." His voice was polite, but the strain showed. He cast a glance around the room. Some diners were already gathering their things, preparing to leave. Nicholas let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "The greater good?" His voice darkened. "You know, I once thought this place was worth investing in." He exhaled sharply. The vibe, the warmth, the welcome. He let his words linger before his eyes turned ice cold. "But I pulled out, and now I'm glad." Ethan flinched. "If I had known it would end up like this, run by someone willing to sell out loyal customers over a few threats, I never would have stepped foot in here." Karoline nodded, her eyes burning with conviction. She turned to Nicholas, voice steady. "You're right, Nick. We've given them too much." She faced Ethan one last time, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think refusing us saves this place?" Her lips curled into a knowing smirk. "You're wrong." Beat of silence. "You just lost the most valuable thing this restaurant had." She let it hang in the air. "Trust." The room shifted again. From the doorway, the man in the leather jacket suddenly reappeared. "I'm with her." His voice was firm. "I've eaten here for 10 years, but after tonight I'm done." A ripple of movement. A few others nodded, standing, pushing in their chairs. Across the room, the progressive diners remained seated, murmuring amongst themselves, but their expressions weren't as sure as before. Karoline turned to Nicholas, and in that silent moment, something clicked between them. "We don't need this place anymore, Nick." Her voice was low, steady. Then she lifted her phone again. "But I won't let them forget this." The moment it cracked, Karoline lifted her phone one last time, her voice steady and unwavering as she spoke into the live stream. "This is proof. They chose fear over loyalty. But we won't bow." The Liberty Bistro trembled. Chairs scraped against the floor. Sharp whispers cut through the air. Diners rose, some in support, others in silent protest, and a few just to escape the battlefield the restaurant had become. Karoline lowered her phone after her final words, her gaze locking onto Ethan Caldwell. He was still behind the stand, his knuckles white as he gripped the reservation book. Beside her, Nicholas tilted his head slightly, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Hear that, Mr. Caldwell?" He nodded toward the shifting crowd. "That's the sound of loyalty, the loyalty you just threw away." His words landed like a slap. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to keep his professional mask in place, but his voice wavered. "Mrs. Leavitt, Mr. Riccio, I'm sorry if this caused a misunderstanding. We don't want to lose you." His forced smile barely held as he adjusted his stance. "Perhaps if you'd accept the private room, we'd be happy to serve you, on the house, as an apology." Karoline let out a sharp, cold laugh, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. "A private room?" she scoffed. "You think I'll hide in a corner like some criminal just to save your face?" She took a slow step forward, her gaze unflinching. "No way, Mr. Caldwell. We don't need your handouts." She turned to Nicholas, her eyes burning. "See, Nick? They think they can buy us off with a free meal after humiliating us in front of everyone." Nicholas nodded, his expression darkening. He turned his gaze back to Ethan. "You just made a bad calculation, Mr. Caldwell." His tone was calm but lethal. I once thought this place was worth investing in. It had something special. Warmth, hospitality, a soul. He exhaled, shaking his head. But now I see it's just another place willing to sell out over a few narrow-minded threats. His voice dropped lower. You don't deserve this place. The words cracked the tension in the room. From the doorway, the leather-jacketed man who had stormed out suddenly returned, his voice booming across the restaurant. I've spent thousands here over the years, but after tonight, I'm done. He grabbed his coat, yanked his sleeve, and strode out once more, this time dragging 2 table-mates with him. The glass door slammed shut behind them, sealing the moment like a firm period at the end of a sentence. Across the room, something shifted. By the bar, the young waitress who had whispered to Karoline earlier reached for the knot of her apron, her fingers trembling as she untied it. She set it down, carefully, deliberately on the counter. Then she stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. Mr. Caldwell, I quit. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Lisa, his voice cracked. Don't do this. We need you. Lisa shook her head, stepping out from behind the bar. She cast a quick glance at Karoline, almost like an apology, before walking toward the exit. Then another domino fell. The kitchen door swung open, and out stepped Marco, the head chef. He was a tall man with sleeves rolled up, the same man who had once made mousse for Nicholas and Karoline during their engagement. He took in the scene, his sharp gaze flicking from Ethan to the restless crowd. Then, with a scoff, he ripped off his apron and slung it over his shoulder. I'm done too. His voice carried through the hushed room. 15 years in this kitchen and I've never seen management this stupid. Refusing loyal customers over some online noise? He let out a disgusted laugh. I want no part of it. He tossed his apron onto the floor and stormed out the back door, leaving Ethan standing there, ghostly pale, watching the foundation of his restaurant crumble. Then came another blow. A man in a gray suit stood again, his voice sharp as he pointed at Ethan. You just lost your best chef. He turned toward Karoline, nodding. I signed a deal with her last year. She's the best customer this place ever had. His phone was already out, his fingers flying over the screen. I'll make sure the world knows. A second later, a notification pinged across the room. Boycott Liberty Bistro. It had begun. The progressive group at their table still sat, but their confidence had cracked. Near the bar, a woman in a cashmere sweater leaned toward her friend, her voice hushed but uneasy. She's overreacting. Her friend hesitated, sneaking another glance at Karoline. Sure, but I didn't expect the staff to flip like this. A pause. Maybe Caldwell screwed up. The doubt had set in. Across the restaurant, a middle-aged woman in a business suit rose to her feet, her voice clipped and sharp. I still back Mr. Caldwell. We don't want Trump politics here, but... She cast a hard look at Ethan. You need to handle this better. Karoline turned to Nicholas, her voice low but resolute. See, Nick? She nodded toward the breaking restaurant. They're destroying themselves, staff quitting, customers leaving, all because he picked the wrong side. She lifted her phone again, glancing at the live stream. The numbers were soaring, the cost of betrayal thousands watched. Comments flooded in, the live stream's chat ablaze with a mix of outrage and accusations of liberal hypocrisy. Karoline turned to the camera, her voice clear and unyielding. See this, everyone? This is the cost of hate. They're not just kicking us out, they're driving away the people who built this place. Nicholas let his gaze sweep over Ethan, his expression cold. Mr. Caldwell, you've got one last shot to fix this. He exhaled, shaking his head. But I'm guessing you won't. You're too scared of the online mob to see what's right in front of you. He gestured toward Marco, now walking out the back door. Toward Lisa, apron discarded, standing near the exit. Toward the diners, scraping their chairs as they left. Ethan stepped forward, his voice trembling but still grasping at politeness. Mr. Riccio. Mrs. Leavitt. I don't want to lose staff or customers, but I have no choice. If I serve you, we'll lose more. His throat bobbed. I hope you'll understand and leave to avoid bigger trouble. He glanced around, searching for support, but all he found were angry stares or empty faces. Karoline shook her head, her eyes blazing. Understand? She scoffed. You just lost your chef, your staff, your customers, and you think we're the problem? She leaned in slightly. No, Mr. Caldwell. You did this to yourself. She turned to Nicholas, voice taut with disgust. I don't want to be here another second, Nick, but I'll make sure they remember tonight forever. The exodus continued. Near the window, an older couple stood abruptly. The husband's voice boomed across the room. We don't spend money at places that discriminate. They walked out, pulling others along with them. The movement rippled. Boycott Liberty Bistro spread through phones, screens lighting up with shares and reposts. At the bar, a young man murmured to his friend, voice low but certain. Caldwell's toast. He doesn't even know who he just messed with. The air in the Liberty Bistro grew thick, weighed down by the hush of whispers, the shuffle of hurried exits. Karoline stood at the epicenter of the chaos, her phone still in hand, her eyes burning, as she gave Ethan one last look. Beside her, Nicholas gripped her hand tighter, his cold gaze sweeping over Caldwell's pale face, watching the manager struggle to hold his composure. The glass door slammed behind another departing customer. Sound rang like a drumbeat, signaling the collapse of what had once been a symbol of luxury. Karoline took a deep breath. Her voice dropped, but the edge remained as sharp as a knife. I'm done, Nick. We don't need another second here. She faced Ethan directly, her stare like a dagger. Hear that, Mr. Caldwell? We're leaving. Not because you won, but because we refuse to waste another second on a restaurant that betrayed us. She lifted her phone again. One last time. To the thousands watching, this is our final moment at Liberty Bistro. Her voice was steady, unwavering. They chose fear over loyalty, and we're choosing to leave with our dignity. Nicholas nodded, his expression darkening. Mr. Caldwell, you thought refusing us would save this place. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You're wrong. You just lost what made it worth saving. He gestured toward the empty kitchen door, toward the abandoned apron behind the bar. See? They're not leaving because of us. He met Caldwell's eyes, cold and sure. They're leaving because of you. Ethan stepped forward, hands shaking, his voice cracking as he struggled to hold it together. Mr. Riccio, Mrs. Leavitt, I'm so sorry it came to this. I never wanted to lose you or anyone, but I had no choice. His voice strained. If I served you, we'd lose more customers. I'm just trying to protect the restaurant. He glanced around, pleading for agreement, but all he saw were hardened expressions. A woman in a business suit shook her head. A man in a gray suit scoffed. No one stood with him. Karoline let out a sharp laugh, the sound piercing. Protect the restaurant? Her voice dripped with disbelief. You just lost your head chef, your staff, dozens of customers, and you think that's protecting it? She shook her head, turning to Nicholas. Let's go. We deserve better than this. She paused just for a moment, before turning back to Ethan, her gaze locking onto his. You know, Mr. Caldwell, I once thought this place was home. Her voice softened, but there was no warmth left in it. We celebrated wins here. He proposed to me here. We shared some of our best moments here. She exhaled, gaze hardening. And look what you've turned it into. A place where loyalty means nothing. She raised her phone once more, facing the live stream audience. Everyone watching, this is the lesson. When you choose fear over what's right, you lose everything. She turned back to Ethan, her words a final warning. And Mr. Caldwell, you just started something you can't stop. Nicholas rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and final. She's right. I once thought this place was worth investing in, because of its vibe, its warmth, its hospitality. He let out a breath, shaking his head. But now, it's just an empty shell under you. His gaze flicked toward the remaining diners. You want to keep a small group of customers over the people who built this place? Fine. Let's see where that takes you. A final wave of movement. The man in the gray suit stood, lifting his phone. I just posted. Boycott Liberty Bistro. It's already everywhere. And just like that, the final domino fell. The collapse of Liberty Bistro. Ethan Caldwell had shot himself in the foot, and the sound of his mistake echoed in the rhythmic thud of departing footsteps. A man in a gray suit marched toward the door, dragging others with him, their shoes beating against the hardwood like a drumroll of abandonment. By the window, an older couple stood abruptly. The wife's voice rang out clear and unwavering. "We don't spend money at discriminatory places like this. Goodbye." They left their table untouched, their half-filled glasses of wine sloshing like spilled blood against the white linen. Across the room, the progressive diners who had stayed now wavered. The woman in the cashmere sweater whispered to her friend, uncertainty lacing her tone. "She's dramatic, sure, but Caldwell botched this. Badly. I don't know if I want to stay." Her friend hesitated, stealing a glance at Karoline and Nicholas. Doubt flickered in her eyes. A woman in a business suit pushed back her chair. Her voice was sharp but unsteady. "I still support you, Mr. Caldwell. But you need to control this better. It's spiraling out of hand." Karoline turned to Nicholas. Their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. "We don't need to prove anything anymore." Karoline's voice was steady as she spoke. "They've made it clear themselves, Nick." She turned back to Ethan, the finality in her gaze like a gavel hitting wood. "Mr. Caldwell, here's my last statement. You picked the wrong side and you'll see the fallout. We're leaving, but you won't escape what you've caused." Nicholas tightened his grip on her hand, his expression unforgiving. "You wanted to protect this restaurant?" His voice was low but lethal. "You just wrecked it." He shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "I once thought this was a Manhattan gem, but now, it's just ashes under you." He turned to Karoline, his voice softer now, just for her. "Let's go, babe. We'll find somewhere worthier." Their footsteps rang in tandem, Karoline's heels clicking against the wood, blending with the firm thud of Nicholas's leather shoes. The remaining diners reacted in waves. Some clapped in support, some jeered, in protest, but most simply watched, caught in the collision of admiration and uncertainty. Near the door, the man in the leather jacket raised a fist. "Good luck, Karoline. Don't let them drag you down." A few others nodded, raising their phones to capture the moment. Karoline paused at the door, turning back one last time. She didn't speak. She just smiled, a look of pride and defiance cutting through the tension like a blade. Then, with one final motion, she lifted her phone, ending the live stream with a single declaration. "Thanks for watching, everyone. This is how we leave, not as losers, but as winners. Remember tonight, because they never will." The screen went dark, but her words hung in the air, thick and inescapable. Ethan Caldwell stood frozen behind the hostess stand, his hands limp at his sides, his face white as paper. He looked around. All he saw was wreckage, empty tables, departed staff, diners still whispering among themselves, their voices laced with uncertainty and judgment. The Liberty Bistro, once a haven of luxury, a symbol of prestige, was now a hollow shell, and Karoline and Nicholas had walked out, leaving behind a ruin Ethan couldn't salvage. Outside, the city pulsed on. The Manhattan streetlights cast a golden glow over Karoline's proud, unshaken figure and Nicholas's calm, commanding presence. They strode toward their Cadillac Escalade, not once looking. Back and behind them, Liberty Bistro stood, its walls intact, its chandeliers still gleaming, but its soul was gone. And just 10 minutes later, the final collapse began. Not in bricks, not in fire, but in an irreparable loss of trust, reputation, and clientele. Inside, Ethan lingered behind the counter, the weight of silence suffocating, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of feet, the hush of whispered doubts, all the signs of an empire crumbling in real time. Desperate, he summoned his last shred of control, forcing his voice into professional steadiness. "Everyone, please stay calm. We'll get through this. It's just a small misunderstanding. But his words fell into the void. Unanswered, unbelieved. Loyal diners rose in droves. The man in the gray suit, the one who had signed a major deal with Karoline, stood one last time. His expression was stone cold as he pointed at Ethan. "You just lost everything, Mr. Caldwell." He grabbed his coat and stormed out, dragging 3 tablemates with him. Near the window, the older couple followed, the husband's voice carrying through the air, "We don't support discriminatory places. Goodbye." They left their table intact. Red wine swirled violently in their glasses, like fresh blood on a battlefield. Even the progressive group, once Ethan's staunchest supporters, had begun to fracture. The woman in the cashmere sweater leaned in toward her friend, voice hushed, but laced with doubt. "I thought keeping Trump politics out was the right move in one, but look at this place." Her friend's gaze drifted toward the bar, where Lisa's abandoned apron still lay. She swallowed hard. "I don't want to stay." And with that she stood, pulling her friend along. They passed the scattered remnants of a once vibrant restaurant. Shame and uncertainty etched in their faces, but the loss wasn't just in customers. It was deeper than that. Marco, the head chef, had left through the back, but the echo of his decision still lingered, and with every footstep, every chair pushed back, every hush of departing voices, the realization sank in. Liberty Bistro was finished, and Ethan Caldwell, he was standing in its ruins. The fall of Liberty Bistro from behind the bartender who had watched in silence finally stepped forward. His voice wavered, but his conviction was clear. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm quitting too. I can't work in a place where loyal customers get treated like this." He untied his apron, tossed it onto the counter, and turned away without another word. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out, just a choked, strangled sound. His hands clenched into fists. Then, his phone buzzed violently. Boycott Liberty Bistro was everywhere, not just from the diners inside, but from thousands online who had watched Karoline's livestream. Near the bar, a young man still seated with his friend stared at his phone, wide-eyed. "Look at this. It's trending worldwide. Over 1 million mentions in 10 minutes. His friend shook his head, scoffing. "Caldwell's finished. He has no idea who he just messed with." Without another word, they stood, leaving their half-drunk beers abandoned on the table. Then, the media pounced. A New York Post alert lit up phone screens across the restaurant. White House press secretary denied service at Manhattan restaurant. Customers and staff abandoned in droves. CNN and Fox News weren't far behind. Discrimination scandal rocks Liberty Bistro. That same night, a major sponsor who had held quarterly events at Liberty Bistro sent an email. "We're pulling all contracts. We don't support hypocrisy." Ethan saw the notification from his assistant. His stomach dropped. His face paled. As he read the words over and over, he stepped forward into the center of the restaurant, his voice trembling, still clinging to politeness. "Everyone, please stay. We'll fix this, I promise. We're still a restaurant that welcomes all." But his words were cut off by a middle-aged man who had been sitting quietly. He stood. His voice was harsh. "Welcomes all? You just kicked out a couple over her job. I don't trust you anymore." He turned and walked out, pulling a few others with him. One by one, more diners followed. They didn't argue. They didn't shout. They simply left. And in just 10 minutes, Liberty Bistro lost nearly all its customers. Tables, once alive with laughter, now held only rumpled linens, half-empty glasses, and silence. The remaining staff, a handful of servers and kitchen workers, began murmuring among themselves, their eyes flashing between fear and resentment. An older server approached Ethan. His voice was low but firm. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm staying because I need the money, but I don't support this. You were wrong to kick them out." Ethan turned to him, his eyes flashing with frustration. "I had no choice. If I served them, we'd lose that other group. They're a big revenue stream." But the server shook his head, cutting him off. "Don't you see? You just lost both." He gestured around at the emptied restaurant. "People like Mrs. Leavitt, and people like us who've worked here for years." With that, he turned away, leaving Ethan standing alone. His hands trembled as he surveyed the wreckage. The collapse, of Liberty Bistro wasn't just financial. It was a failure of ideology. He had preached inclusion, but excluded those who didn't fit the narrow views of the few he had chosen to protect. Now, the once luxurious Liberty Bistro was just a hollow shell. A young man near the door on his way out turned back one last time. His voice rang through the empty space. "Mr. Caldwell, you just killed this place yourself. Good luck cleaning up the wreckage." Ethan stood frozen in the center of his dying empire. The chandeliers above cast cold shadows over his face, highlighting red-rimmed eyes and tightly pressed lips. Around him, only empty chairs, only abandoned glasses, only the last staff slipping away one by one. His phone kept buzzing, canceled reservations, press calls, staff quitting. But he didn't pick up. His voice cracked as he whispered to himself, I just wanted to protect the restaurant." But his words dissolved into the silence, unheard, uncared for. Meanwhile, across the city, the Cadillac Escalade glided through Manhattan's glowing streets. The lights of the skyline streaked past the windows as Karoline Leavitt and Nicholas Riccio sat in the back, leaving the wreckage of Liberty Bistro behind. Karoline rested her head on Nicholas's shoulder. Her eyes were still fierce, but now tinged with relief. "You know, Nick?" she murmured. Her voice was low but steady. "I don't regret walking away. They didn't deserve us." Nicholas smiled, squeezing her hand. "I agree, Karoline." Then, with a smirk, he added, "But I'm starving. We need a new spot for dinner." For the first time that night, Karoline laughed, a sound free of sarcasm, free of tension. "All right," she said. "You pick, but this time, it's gotta be a place that values us." Nicholas nodded, pulling out his phone. After a few quick taps, his eyes lit up. "Patriot Grill," he said. "Frank, the owner, texted me earlier. He says there's always a table for our family." Karoline nodded. "Sounds good. Let's go." The car turned onto a quieter street, pulling up to Patriot Grill, a place smaller than Liberty Bistro, but warmer. The golden light spilled onto the sidewalk, welcoming them inside. And this time, they weren't just customers. They belonged. As Karoline and Nicholas stepped out of the car, the warm glow from Patriot Grill's lanterns spilled onto the sidewalk. The front door swung open, and out strode Frank, an older man with silver hair and a wide grin. "Karoline, Nicholas," he boomed, his voice full of warmth. "Welcome to my house. I just saw your live stream. Whole world's talking about that Liberty Bistro mess. Come in, come in." The moment they stepped inside, Patriot Grill's cozy atmosphere wrapped around them. The rich aroma of grilled steak filled the air, mingling with the hum of cheerful conversation. The staff exchanged friendly glances, and the energy in the room was electric, not with tension but with genuine camaraderie. Frank led them to a table near the fireplace, clapping Nicholas on the shoulder. "I told you ages ago, Liberty Bistro wasn't worth your time. Now they've ruined themselves. And look where you are." Nicholas chuckled, shaking his head. "Frank, you were right. This is home." Karoline took in the restaurant. No extravagant chandeliers, no pristine white linens, but it had something Liberty Bistro never could. Authenticity. She pulled out her phone, checking the numbers on her live stream. Her eyes widened. "Look at this, Nick," she said, turning the screen toward him. "Stand with Karoline is trending #1 worldwide." Nicholas glanced at it, then at her, a slow smile spreading. "They thought they could shut you out. Instead, they made you stronger." Frank returned, setting 2 glasses of red wine on the table with a wink. "A welcome gift from me. And I told the kitchen, your steaks are coming up. Best in town. Not even that Liberty Bistro bunch can touch us." Nicholas raised his glass. "Thanks, Frank. This is what we needed. A place that values loyalty." Karoline took a sip, the warmth spreading beyond the wine. "Exactly. We don't need fake places like Liberty Bistro." As they talked, Karoline's phone buzzed again. A news alert from the New York Post. Liberty Bistro temporarily closes after denying White House press secretary. Customers and staff flee in droves. She read it aloud, her voice tinged with disbelief. 10 minutes, Nick. It only took 10 minutes for them to fall apart. Nicholas leaned back, shaking his head. Ethan Caldwell thought he could win. He was wrong. Frank chuckled. Oh, it's worse than that. Their big clients are pulling contracts, staff are quitting left and right. Word is they won't even last 48 hours. Karoline didn't even have to say it. Liberty Bistro had destroyed itself. She lifted her phone and hit the live stream button again. Hey everyone, Karoline Leavitt here. Live from Patriot Grill with my husband Nicholas. We just left Liberty Bistro where they refused to serve us because of my job. But look at us now. She turned the camera to Nicholas and Frank, both raising their glasses. They tried to shut us out, but they lost. We're here, stronger than ever, surrounded by people who value loyalty and truth. A ripple of applause swept through the restaurant. A man at a nearby table stood, raising his beer. You did great, Karoline. Don't let them drag you down. Karoline ended the stream, setting her phone aside. She turned to Nicholas, her voice softer now, reflective. This wasn't just about dinner. It was a lesson. Nicholas nodded, reaching across the table for her hand. Betray the people who trust you and you lose everything. Exactly, Karoline said. Ethan thought he was protecting his restaurant, but he forgot the most important thing. You don't throw away loyalty. She looked around at the room, at the people still clapping, at the warmth that filled the space. And us? We found a place that knows the worth of truth. Nicholas grinned, lifting his glass one last time. To us, Karoline, and to what we stand for. Their glasses clinked together, the sound of victory ringing between them.